Hi, everyone. My name is Christopher Bruce. I'm a South Florida divorce attorney, and I have the pleasure of being joined today via Zoom by Guy Jeanty. He's a psychotherapist in the Broward County area, and today what we're going to talk about is something that I think is really important, and it's dealing with infidelity in relationships. Infidelity happens to a lot of people. It's much more common than people think, and I think what Guy and I are going to talk about a little bit is, although it's hard to deal with, hard to process, it can actually be, for some people, a real turning point in improving their relationship. So we're going to dive into all this, and I guess before we get too far into it, Guy, maybe just introduce yourself, a little bit about your background, and we'll talk about all this stuff.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much, Chris, for inviting me to be a part of this conversation. And it's a very, very important conversation, as you mentioned, with respect to the topic of infidelity. And unfortunately, it can derail a lot of lives, in some cases, families even. So with that said, my name is Guy Jeanty, as you've indicated, and I'm originally from Port-au-Prince, Haiti. Grew up in Miami, and from a pretty large family. And when I was about 12 years of age, my two older brothers enlisted in the U.S. Army. And when they came home, I remember how happy I was to see them, but more excited, though, to see them in their uniform and seeing pictures of them with M16, rifles and things of that nature. And I was all boy. Right away, I knew that's something that I wanted to do, to follow in their footsteps. And sure enough, after graduating from high school, I enlisted in the military, joined the U.S. Army, served for about 6 years, and was very happy with it, but I didn't feel that it's a career path that I wanted to pursue. And so, long story short, went to college, and then I entered the healthcare industry, where I worked as a counselor in the hospice setting. And I worked with a lot of hospice patients and their families in hospital settings. So a lot of hospice patients, in their homes. So a lot of hospice patients in nursing homes, assisted living facilities. And so I did that for about, a good 12 years, as a hospice counselor. And it was through that experience that I realized that I wanted to pursue higher education in terms of, increasing my skills as a counselor. And that sort of led me to consider a doctorate, in marriage and family therapy. And and I've been licensed as a psychotherapist since 2003. I actually hold two licenses, one as a licensed mental health counselor, and the second license is that of a licensed marriage and family therapist. And so I've been practicing as a psychotherapist for nearly 20 years right now.
Okay, well, that's a admirable background and a pretty interesting one too. I guess maybe one day I'll have to ask you if you're a hopeless Dolphins fan too. But anyway,
they've broken my heart too many times, Chris.
So we're talking today, add a little humor to what could be a hard topic for people, but infidelity. And one of the things I wanted to ask you first, just from what you see in your practice. What do you see infidelity to be? I take it kind of means a lot of different things to different people depending on somebody's background and value system. So maybe you could just speak to that for a second.
Well, that's a very good question, and I think more and more, we as a society, I'm going to speak a little bit broadly here, that we're coming to have a more varied understanding about what infidelity is and what it actually means. And so I think traditionally that we were able to sort of define infidelity in fairly narrow ways, and that infidelity might have to do specifically, traditionally speaking, with a spouse or a partner committing an act of betrayal of a sexual nature. But in light of the fact that these days We're so digitally connected, not only with our family members, not only with friends, not only with spouses. We're also digitally connected with exes, people that we maybe dated in high school, people that maybe we dated in college, people that we work with who may become attracted to us, or that we may become attracted to them. And so when we talk about these days, what infidelity is, it can present in many, many different ways. And so I think that fundamentally it's really, really important to understand what infidelity is within a particular context. And that particular context is the context of the relationship between the two individuals, and in some cases maybe more than two individuals, but that's a topic for today. And so, but
infidelity in the 2020,
yes, indeed. But fundamentally, infidelity has to do fundamentally with a breach of trust, and that is whether it was an explicit agreement between two people, or whether or not it might have been an implied agreement. And in many relationships, the kind of agreements or expectations that people have more often than not are implied agreements that never get discussed, and then one person find themselves breaching a particular unstated expectation or unstated agreement that can cause tremendous hurt, pain, and anguish for the person who feel that their spouse or their partner should have known their expectations and desires were. So again, infidelity fundamentally is about a breach of trust.
And I mean, that's from what you're saying. I mean, as a divorce lawyer, I hear a lot of people say a lot of different, things. I always try to ask, why do you want to get divorced? And it's interesting, I guess you'd say, breaches of trust. I think that's a good way to put it. How sometimes they're, maybe implied agreements or implied things, and it's interesting. It varies by person to person.
Absolutely,
for sure. So where, and maybe this is just you could probably talk for an hour on this, but just for most of the people, why does infidelity happen in a relationship? What kind of, and I think it's probably important for people to understand, why does this happen, especially if they're in a state of trauma now as they're processing it. But what causes infidelity to happen in your experience?
That's a very good question, Chris, and I appreciate you asking it. In fact, it is a question that that couples struggle with. It's a question that at the forefront of most couples' mind, particularly the person who has been injured, shall we say, by the act of of infidelity. And so I think the why question is somewhat misleading. And when I say misleading, I mean it from this point of view. That is, we can have an expectation or a belief that there is one particular reason that my spouse, my husband, my wife, my boyfriend, whoever it is, say cheated, with another person. And so the why question in reality is a bit more complex. And so what tends to happen, in my experience, is that the person who's been, shall we say, the person who's been injured, in the relationship, there's a part of them that a very visceral part of them wants to figure out, wants to know, why did this happen? Why did you do this to me? And it's a valid question. It's a very, very valid question. However, it assumes a couple of things. Number one, it sort of assumes that there might be one particular reason. Okay, in some cases maybe, but generally there's a lot more to it than that. And so it also, I think, assumes that the person who, shall we say, who was the non-monogamous partner, or the person who, who caused the injury, there's an assumption that they themselves actually know exactly why they committed the act of infidelity. And oftentimes, in some cases, the person who committed the act of betrayal, they may not necessarily know exactly all of the ramifications or all of the reasons, all of the factors that went into them making that decision. One of the things that I often say to couples, just to kind of help to kind of give them some context about this very question, is that as hurtful, as painful, and as traumatic as that act, as that experience is, it's important, really, really important, to try to wrap our mind around the idea that the person that we're married to, the person that we're in a relationship with, they didn't just happen to wake up one morning and decide that I'm going to cheat on my spouse.
Yeah.
So typically, many things that happen beforehand that contributes. I tend to like to use the word contributes with couples as opposed to the word causal, because the brain wants very much to find causal linkages, but in a situation that involves complex human experience, human emotions, and things of that nature, is very difficult. And part of what sometimes makes it hard for couples is that there is a desire and sometimes a demand for a clear and precise answer or explanation from the person who committed the act of infidelity. But the person who may have committed the act of infidelity, sometimes they may not necessarily be able to articulate concisely and precisely what was behind it. And so sometimes it takes a little bit of time to sort of help people to kind of flesh that out. So so that why question is a relevant question, but at the same time, it's not as simple as people would like for it to be, because there are many factors that goes into that. And so just one quick thing that, in some cases, one might say that a person committed the act of infidelity because of, a boredom, or maybe in some cases, it's a way of exiting a relationship. Okay, and sometimes a person may have committed the act of infidelity as an act of revenge. Well, you cheated on me, so guess what? So now I'm going to return the favor. But all of those kinds of things really sort of gloss over some of the more deeper underlying factors that takes the relationship to that place to begin with.
Do you find that, in at least a number of the cases of infidelity that you see in the couples that you work with and clients that you work with, that there's usually at least a little bit of both people, both parties to the relationship kind of being jointly responsible? I mean, I know there's situations to where obviously you have people who are abusive, or they have certain types of disorders or addictions, but that aside, I mean, do you find that at the real root, usually both people in the relationship have a part to play in what manifests as the infidelity?
That's a fantastic question. I really appreciate that, because the short answer to the question, Chris, is yes, that is the case. However, from a therapeutic standpoint, it takes a lot of preparation with the couple before they can get to a place where they can begin to consider the different layers, the different factors that, again, I'm going back to that word that I mentioned previously, that contributed to the evolution, to the development of a marriage or relationship where one partner made a decision to cheat on another person. So with that said, from a therapeutic standpoint, one of the things that's very essential for me when a couple comes in, is number one is to acknowledge the sheer pain, the anguish, and the heartbreak that has occurred. That's point one. And I sort of, there from a metaphorical standpoint as acknowledging the fact that one partner here is bleeding, emotionally speaking.
Yeah.
And so the focus is on, let's figure out what we need to do to stop the bleeding. Let's acknowledge this pain, this hurt, okay? And so in doing that, it allows for a process where a cognitive shift is beginning to occur, where the person who's been injured, the person who's been hurt, where their anguish, where their pain is being acknowledged. And if their pain and anguish is being acknowledged, then they're less likely to need to fight to make that point, to try to convince someone or their spouse or a therapist about that. And so that's priority one, to help to sort of establish, acknowledging the pain, to sort of help to establish some level of emotional stability, some level of emotional equilibrium, so that both people can be present enough emotionally where they can hear each other without reacting out of pain and anguish. Okay, and so that can take a little bit of time to get a particular person, a couple, to that place, and so for some people it may take them several sessions. Traditionally speaking, it may take several sessions to get to a place where a person feel heard enough to where they can begin to even be open and considering the possibility that, yes, what your husband or what your wife did was grotesque, was insensitive, was hurtful, demeaning, disrespectful, and so acknowledging that piece, and then to be able to then say, we need to also take a step back and to try to look at the bigger picture. And by the bigger picture, I mean is that let's look at some of the different factors that may have played a role. They may not necessarily been things that either one of you thought about or have done consciously, but let's just kind of take a step back to see what may have been some of the factors that rendered the relationship perhaps vulnerable to this situation, occurring. So this is not about blaming anybody necessarily, but it's more so that we can take a more instructive look, so that we can see what needs to be seen, so that we can figure out where the vulnerabilities were, so that we can figure out where we need to work, to figure out what needs to be repaired. And so it takes a bit of time to establish some level of trust between myself and the couple, so that they can feel that that they're not going to be battered, in the process. And so it's really a delicate balance. It's a dance that's necessary to be done. And I always say that it's important, to pace the session in such a way that the person who's been injured, that he or she feels heard, that they're not being pushed into something that they're not ready for. And the person who committed the act of betrayal, it's important to keep them engaged, because if that person feel like they're being beat up, they're not going to stick around. They're not going to stick around, and it just makes things even more difficult. So, but again, great question.
It sounds like I mean, acknowledging the other person's pain is very important to do, right off the bat. And, I always recommend people to, see a, really good therapist that's, qualified and experienced in dealing with this type of stuff. But, just maybe from what you do in therapy and also just maybe practical things for people who are, processing this right now that haven't, yet made it into your office. What are some practical things that, you think couples can do in processing and trying to, recover their relationship from infidelity? Maybe some things that might keep them out of my office.
Well, that's a good question, but it's also a tough, question. So let me try to approach it, this way. Again, every couple obviously, is different. Every couple is as unique as, the fingerprints, that we carry. And so, what's important, is for people to be able to have some sense of being able to figure out what they need in that moment, in that space. And again, it's not always clear to people. I want to be very, very, very clear about that. It's not always clear to a person what it is that they need. Because in some sense, the person that they've opened their hearts to, the person to whom they've given the keys to their heart, it's that person that is causing the heartbreak. It's that person that's causing the anguish. It's that person that is causing them to feel enraged, angry. And so they're not sure what they want from that person. I want you to console me. I want you to comfort me, but no, I want you to get away from me because you're the reason why I'm in such pain. And so people can sort of have, sort of like almost like a Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde kind of an experience, in that space. And so typically when people lack the ability to self-regulate, to self-soothe, to be able to calm their own emotions, then that too inadvertently end up exacerbating the situation to where people end up making decisions that complicates matters even further. Okay, so having said that, for people who are able to sort of take a deep breath, center themselves, sometimes it's helpful to be able to say to your wife, your husband, or the person that you're in a relationship with, I need some space, I need some time, just to figure out what I even think about all of this. I need some space, I need an opportunity to try to wrap my brain around what has happened. That doesn't necessarily mean and run to your office.
Yeah.
But what tends to happen, Chris, is that in the throes of infidelity, particularly when two people are living in the same space, that the oxygen gets sucked out of that space, and people can feel emotionally like they're suffocating. And so that's the point, that's the perspective from which I speak when I say that sometimes what may be necessary is for the person who's been hurt to simply recognize what they need. And what they need may simply be that, you know what, I need a little bit of space, I need a little time for myself, so that I can get some clarity about what I think and what I need. And that will help me to better understand, to better know what to ask you for and how you can be part of this solution. And so I think that's the first step. You know, being able to find a way to get some distance so that you can get some clarity. And that can mean anything. You know, sometimes it may mean, you know, going for a drive. It may mean if there's a close friend or a very good family member that you trust, who respects you, who respect your relationship, that you need to spend the night over, but in a safe place where people are not going to take advantage of a person's emotions and things of that nature. And so to be able to find a space where you can begin to sort of bring down, lower the temperature so that people can have better clarity. And so I think that's one of the more important things with respect to the question that you're asking.
I know just from us knowing each other for a little while now, one of the things you do a lot of work with is couples and you know, challenges in their relationship, things like infidelity. And I know one of the things you're telling me about, and this is not really meant to be any type of commercial for you, but you do intensives, you know, a little bit more time with people, I think, in, you know, sometimes larger blocks of time to help work on their relationships. Maybe you could just speak for a minute or two on how does something like that help people, help couples when they have an acute issue arise in their relationship, like infidelity, and how's that work?
Okay, appreciate the question. You know, the couples intensive. Before I address that, let me just kind of, you know, mention about the traditional ways in which couples, you know, tend to be in therapy. You know, typically speaking, you know, people going to therapy, the basic therapy hour is basically 50 minutes, maybe 60 minutes. For most cases and for most situations, that's sufficient, you know, time to address issues, whether it has to do with anxiety or career type issues, depression, and things of that nature. And sometimes for kind of maintenance kinds of issues for couples, traditional hour session, you know, can be sufficient. However, where the 1 hour session becomes problematic, particularly for couples who are experiencing acute distress in their relationship, whether they're going through a divorce or they're thinking about separating, or in the case of what we're talking about, or if infidelity, you know, has occurred, because of the intensity of those kinds of experiences, the traditional 60-minute session typically is not a good way to go. And the reason for that is that given the intensity of the emotions that people bring into the therapeutic process, that oftentimes, you know, for the hour session, issues come up with very little time and opportunity to actually resolve the issues that come about. And so what can happen sometimes is that couples may come away from a 45 to an hour session, they may come away feeling more frustrated and more angry after the session, because all that they've had the opportunity to do is basically vent
Yeah.
for 45 minutes to an hour, and then, okay, I'm sorry, it's time to go. And so the value of an intensive session basically means that it's a session in which a couple is seen for 6 hours or longer. And the value of the intensive is that it enables each person to be able to articulate what he or she thinking, feeling, with the opportunity of not being rushed or not having the session being dictated and controlled by, you know, the clock on the wall. And so it allows couples to actually delve deeply, take a deep dive into the core issues, and also it allows time for actual problem solving. Okay, and so it creates the opportunity where people can find and to create quicker and faster resolution to some of these problems, faster and more quickly. And so that has multiple benefits, for couples. Number one, it helps to decrease the tension. It helps to decrease the volatility, and it helps to establish a better safe space, a better safe zone, for people. And it also has direct correlation to not only emotional, psychological, but it also has direct correlation to physical wellness as well. Because what will happen is that if a person is under a tremendous emotional distress, it means that that their mind and their body essentially is in a state of fight or flight, and which means that their immune system is working overtime to help to compensate for the emotional tension and distress that they're experiencing. And so in an intensive session, we also incorporate a number of other kinds of modalities to help people to sort of actually regulate their physiology so that they can be present both in mind and body, so that we can address the issues and also to have enough emotional energy to invest into the solutions to the problems that they're presented with.
That makes a lot of sense, and I imagine it's probably, for everyone, but especially you, probably takes a lot to mediate all of that, I guess, and in a situation to where, I mean, it's, if things aren't handled properly, sometimes from the very beginning in processing all of this, it, sometimes, might be the end of a relationship. And I guess it kind of, as it relates to, infidelity, I see just in what I do as a divorce lawyer, there's a lot of people in my experience that can, process it and, actually have a better relationship after it, but not everyone, gets there. And just, I'm curious, and I think a lot of people would be very interested to know, just from your perspective, what are some signs that maybe, the relationship issues that infidelity's brought to the surface are possibly signs of a relationship that has run its course, maybe a relationship that's best to come to a close as opposed to, being, for lack of a better word, fixed? How do you know when maybe it's time for both people to move on?
Well, there are a number of signs and indicators that could point to that. Having said that, 20 years plus, into this work, there are some things that I can see that might be indicative, of a relationship that's not likely to be repairable. And a relationship that's not repairable doesn't necessarily have to mean that there's been a failure on the part of the individuals. So I'm going to get back to that, in a moment. But in order to help a couple to figure out whether or not or when a relationship has run its course, requires a great deal of clinical expertise. But Chris, more than anything else, it requires patience on the part of the therapist, and it requires patience on the part of the therapist because it may be obvious to the therapist that some things are just, the wheels are just coming off, and there's no fixing this. However, for the people who are involved in that relationship, who are involved in that marriage, they're emotionally invested. They have a history. They have years, sometimes several decades of life tied into the relationship, invested in the person. And so they may not yet be at a place emotionally. Logically, they could see it. Logically, they could see that this is not going to work. But on an emotional level, they not be at the place where they're ready to exit the relationship. And so it's from that standpoint, it's from the emotional aspect where a clinician, where a therapist needs to be patient with the couple so that the therapist is not driving the process, but that the therapist is working in concert collaboratively from an emotional standpoint, providing the support for the couple and helping them to come to the place of the realization of what it is that they want to do or need to do about a relationship that, for all intents and purposes, appears to be irreparable. And so it's going to take them a little bit of time. One person might see it, the other person might not necessarily see it. And again, just as a caveat here, and that is with the proviso that as long as there's no safety issue at play, that is to say that there's someone who is feeling threatened, as long as there's no issue about physical safety, emotional safety, and things of that nature, then it's important to appreciate the fact that that it may take a minute for a couple to actually come to terms with the fact that a relationship has run its course. Now, having said that, with respect to infidelity in particular, what might be some telltale signs that a relationship is not able to be redeemed or to be reconciled. Let's look at, first of all, the part of, or certain behaviors perhaps, of the person who is the non-monogamous partner, the person who committed an act that injured his or her spouse or partner. If the person who committed the act of infidelity is callous, is unsympathetic, unapologetic, fragrant about the act of infidelity, and doesn't see that they've done anything wrong whatsoever, that is a telltale sign that is a relationship that is just not going to work. Because if the person who, if you have one person who's basically is laying out, metaphorically speaking, in the middle of the road, broken, bleeding, and then their partner just basically looks at them and say, I didn't do anything wrong. And so that's a very, very important indicator that the relationship might not be repairable. Now, on the side of the person who, say, was the injured party, shall we say, or the monogamous partner, if that person finds him or herself constantly angry, enraged, feelings of contempt toward their partner, if they are having relentless, intrusive thoughts that they just can't shake those thoughts, and they are finding themselves becoming angry and bitter, that too,
Yeah.
can be an indication that the pain and the hurt, you know, is so deep that repairing that wound may not be possible within the context of that current relationship. And so for people who are in that camp where rage and anger and intrusive thoughts becomes their norm, then it's probably necessary, for them to begin to sort of contemplate an exit strategy so that he or she can save themselves, because that level of emotional and psychological distress is going to have a ripple effect in the personal life, professionally, and of course, it's going to cause a person's health to deteriorate, in relatively, short time, period as well. And let me just kind of add one other thing as well, Chris. And I know that, you're aware of some of the work that I do as well, with respect, to couples, but specifically, given what we're talking about right now, the fact that there are those situations when, when exiting a relationship is the proper course of action. And I often, when I talk with couples about this, that that when a relationship has come to that place, to begin to make some mental adjustments about it, and that it doesn't have to mean failure if we can look at a relationship and determine that, you know what, we've done the best that we could do for the time that we were together. And so it's been a good ride. It hasn't all been easy, but I feel I've given it everything that I could give it. And if you feel that you've given it everything that you've been able to give to it, there's some redemptive qualities about that. Okay, there's a level of integrity that we can take away in knowing that I did all that I could do, and now, I need to, chart a new course, a new path, because sometimes 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 couples can stay too long. And in those cases, when people stay too long, tragic things can happen, and unfortunately, tragic things do end up happening. And so it's unfortunate, because more often than not, those are situations that could have been averted, and so it's no surprise to any of us that we all know of cases where people commit, acts that cannot be undone because of a very difficult relationship. And so, and unfortunately, this wasn't a case of my own, thankfully, but I was called to a situation, just this February, where a husband and wife, they were undergoing through, a lot of marital distress. And the long and short of it, unfortunately, the husband in that particular case, and this happens sometimes between both genders, males and females, husband and wife, can do desperate, acts. But in this particular instance, in February, this husband, murdered his wife. And sadly, as grotesque as it is, he also, killed his two kids, and then after which he himself committed suicide. And so, it's it's sad, beyond sad. It's tragic. It's tragic because 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 there are better ways. There are other options when a relationship has run its course. To figure out a better course of action to start a new chapter, and so those kinds of situations, unfortunately, as you know, very distressing, heartbreaking, but 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 they don't really need to happen. They don't really need to happen.
Yeah.
There are other options. There are other options.
I mean, I guess on that, and I'm probably using too many buzzwords in one sentence here, but I mean, what's your best advice for couples who want to go through the decoupling process in an amicable way? I mean, when they feel like the relationship has run its course. I mean, what are some of the best ways to go about that process?
Well, again, at the outset, it's important that that people feel safe and that people remain safe. That is the bottom line. That is the bottom line. It's important that we ensure that that there are that there are safety measures in place, and that there is no one, not the wife, not the husband, not the kids. It's important to make sure that everyone is committed to safety. It's important to make sure that everyone is committed to the well-being of the other person. It's important to make sure that people are committed, particularly where there are children. It's important to make sure that that the safety and the well-being of the children, are without question, a priority. Okay, and in the decoupling process, again, is I think it's important. I think it's really, really important. For people to be able to own certain things, and that is regardless of how bad a marriage, might have been. It's important for each person to be able to, to acknowledge and to claim the good things that they brought to the table, to be able to own the good things that they contributed to the marriage. It's also important for each person to be able to acknowledge and to accept, the good things that the other partner was also able to bring into the relationship. Now, why do I say that? Typically, when people get to a stage of feeling the need to part, all too often, people can begin to sort of think about the relationship in very extreme ways, in absolute ways. That is, he was never around. He was always mean to me. Well, the one thing that I can tell you about human nature is that we are predictably inconsistent. And I say that to the point that no one is ever always angry or always mean. No one is never a particular way. Yes, it may feel that way on an emotional level, but there are those instances in the relationship where some good things happen that I found helpful, that I found meaningful, that I found validating. To be able to acknowledge some of those things, and also to be able to make the shift, in exiting the relationship where there is clarity about what are the values that I have, that I feel are no longer being respected, are no longer being respected or valued, that I feel that I need to make a decision about those particular values. And the reason why I frame it that way is that the couples who exit relationship from the standpoint of blame, that is, I'm leaving the relationship because she was unfaithful to me. I'm leaving the relationship because she spent too much money. I'm leaving the relationship because of what she did. Or I'm leaving the relationship because of what he did. When it's framed in that way,
Yeah.
we come away from the relationship with a skewed perspective. That is, we come away from the relationship from the standpoint of something was done to us. That's not to take away from whatever might have happened. You know, we're all human beings. We don't please our partners or our spouses 100% of the time. And so we're going to drop the ball. We're going to fail in the process. But in the decoupling process, I think that it serves each person best if they're able to transition onto their next chapter by saying that, or coming to a place of saying that, I no longer feel that the way that I want to be treated, the way that I want to be loved, and the way that I want to love my spouse, I don't feel that I'm able to do that anymore. And so that is something that is still very important for me. And so I'm holding on to those kind of values. And so I'm going to take this and move into a different direction. It's kind of a subtle kind of a distinction, but I think it's a necessary distinction to try to move from the relationship, to try to move from the place of blame to a place of value. What are the values that you have that are not being cherished, that are not being respected, that you're moving with and taking to a new relationship, rather than the disappointment, the pain and the hurt and the anguish? Because the pain and the hurt and the anguish, if we carry those things with us, well, guess what? It's only going to show up in the next relationship.
Again, yeah. Well, that sounds like a great way of reframing the way of thinking about the situation. And I think maybe if more people did that, they might have a easier time, at least initially, moving on. So I guess we're kind of coming close to the end of the time we had for this. My name's Christopher Bruce. I'm a divorce lawyer in South Florida. I'm here with Guy Jeanty, a psychotherapist, mostly in the Broward County area of South Florida. But Guy, for the people that are listening to this and they're thinking to themselves, well, I'm kind of resonating with you and what you're saying, and what are maybe tell just a little bit more about your practice and how you help people and how people might go about getting in touch with you.
Thanks, Chris. My area of specialization, as I've mentioned, is couples therapy, and and particularly couples who are struggling with needing to repair their relationships, or infidelity has occurred, and trying to figure out what to do about it, what they want to do about it, how to repair the breach of trust, the betrayal that has happened. Those are things, those are areas that I specialize in. And I also do a good bit of work with first responders who struggle with post-traumatic stress disorder, because those men and women, certainly they're impacted in a lot of ways in terms of the kind of work that they do on our behalf, and oftentimes some of the things that they experience, unfortunately, are taken back home, into their families, into their relationships, and so my office is in Davie, and I'm in the process also of opening another office in the North Broward, area. And for people who want to get in contact with me, they can do so by going to my website, which is drjeanty.com. That's drjeanty.com, drjeanty.com, drjeanty.com. Okay,
and just we're doing this by Zoom, but I mean, do you ever do any of the therapy through any of the online ways, just for the people that are listening to this in other areas?
Yeah, great question. Appreciate that. I do some telehealth, counseling, some online sessions, with clients, both individual sessions as well as couples therapy sessions as well. And so, happy to provide that, for folks for easier access.
Well, thank you so much, Guy. I really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to give this information, and I really hope it's helpful for the people who need it. I think we covered a lot of great things here. So thank you very much for your time.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity to spend this time with you today, Chris. Thank you so much.